Hello. So, this is the long patrol version of the live, and so it's for those who like to have the topic discussed without all the interruptions you normally get in the live where people are asking questions. Some people do ask a lot of interesting questions, for good reasons. Now, I'm actually... who knows how many versions of this video I'll end up recording, but this is actually taking place on 12th before the live, so, you know, it's before I've answered those questions. The whole precis, as I understand, sort of the basis of this entire discussion, is what happens at the Battle of Jutland if you have replaced Beatty. And this starts off as a very simple question. Let's replace him with someone. Who are we going to pick? Well, that's a tough one. There are other options. There are. The options, well, you've got Sir Cecil Burney. He's the Deputy Commander of the Grand Fleet. He's a very experienced naval officer. He's a very trusted naval officer. There's also the Chief of Staff of the Grand Fleet, Vice Admiral Sir Charles Edward Madden. Again, another experienced and very capable officer. You have Vice Admiral Thomas Henry Martin Jerram, who is the commander of 2nd Battle Squadron. He's already based in Cromarty Firth. He's used to being in detached command. You have Sir Frederick Charles Doveton Sturdee, who is the commander of 4th Battle Squadron. And, well, there are others you could sort of pick from, but pretty much those are the senior officers available immediately and to hand. Now, the thing is, Jellicoe isn't going to want to chop and change with his senior command, and not when he's got the whole thing running well as it is. So Burney, sorry, not getting the chance. Burney is one of nature's and history's great second-in-commands. He is kind of like Collingwood. He is completely forgotten man of Jutland, and I could do an entire video about the stuff he gets up to in his career. But he is not the right kind of dash you need for the Battlecruiser fleet for the politics of it. Sadly enough, the same pretty much goes for Jerram. Jerram is a perfectly nice, perfectly capable officer who has a wealth of experience. But he is a confirmed battleship man, and he's also not really going to push for it. So as long as we're limited to the rear and to the vice admirals, that leaves us down to pretty much two: Madden, who's Jellicoe's chief of staff, and Sturdee. Madden is good. Honestly, no one would have any objection to Sir Charles Edward Madden becoming the Battlecruiser fleet commander. He would be second in command of the Grand Fleet when David Beatty succeeds Jellicoe. And he is the guy who regularly in exercises beats the living daylights out of Beatty in exercises. So frankly, no one would have any qualms about him taking charge. But again, he's kind of central to what Jellicoe is doing in the Grand Fleet. Specifically, he's in charge of making sure the 15-inch battleships come online with the systems capable and are available that he needs. So I don't think Madden's going to be moved, because those 15-inch ships, they matter a lot, and there's a big part of Jellicoe's judgment of whether those ships are ready or not for Jutland is based in Madden's reports and what Madden's up to. So that leaves us with Sturdee. That's an interesting choice. It's an obvious choice. He's got the dash of the Falklands behind him. He's had independent battlecruiser command. He's had staff command in the Admiralty, so he's got experience and political connections there. He's acceptable. He's well trained in the ways of the Grand Fleet. The reason he's in the Grand Fleet rather than being second in command for Beatty in the Battlecruiser force, which you might think, well, shouldn't an independent fleet, if it's calling itself that, have a second in command who is of equivalently senior rank, is because him and Beatty do not get on in a professional sense. It's one of those funny things. Here is the thing. This might seem strange to people, but sometimes when I say people do not get on, I'm not talking about them actually calling each other names or being like a modern celebrity spat where they're constantly being nasty about each other in social media. No. In fact, in this sort of period, Victorian period, you could not get on with someone professionally, completely disagree with their method of doing things, and you could still be at a dinner party with them and be perfectly polite and civil. And would go shooting and be a part of the shooting party because, that's what you do. And it's not even being two-faced. It's a case of, professionally, I think you're an idiot, but you're a nice person outside of this, so we'll tolerate you. And you can have that. You don't have to be single-minded about people. Okay? The amount of admirals in history who have regularly disagreed with each other on politics, etc., and then needed to work together. They work together. Or socialise together outside of work, despite disagreeing ardently on politics. It's considered a normal thing in navies. Why? Because you don't have to like all of a person to be able to put up with them. If there's a lot of things you don't like them, you don't like their politics, you don't like them professionally, and you think personally they're a rude, arrogant bore, then you don't have to put up with them at all either. You don't have to be their friend. But, you can be a mature adult about it. Shameless book plug. Thank you as ever for all your support. Seriously, without all the stuff you all do, supporting the channel, liking it, sharing it, all that stuff, the channel would be nowhere near where it is today. And without your support personally, I would not be anywhere near where I am today, where frankly, I can sort of say that I am, despite not having a tenure or permanent post at a university, a fully practicing naval historian. Which is scary sometimes to think about, but is also a lot of fun. So, that's all thanks to you. And very soon, the second edition of this should be for sale. And that's the paperback edition, and hopefully that will sell out and do well, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. Oh yeah. Honestly, this whole video, I have to say, gets kind of interesting as I go on, and this is stepping out of the topic, but then discussing it. Gets interesting because of the amount of ripples it's going to have, and it would have. Because you change officers back in this time, prior to Jutland, and change their positions, you can change entire career trajectories. You are not just changing who is what position as commander of the Battlecruiser fleet. So, as I've already mentioned, where was Sturdee historically? Well, Sturdee was historically during Jutland. He was at the Battle of Jutland. He was there in command of 4th Battle Squadron. He was technically, in the order of battle for Jutland, 3rd in command. Because whilst it theoretically should have been Jerem, who was, I think, the slightly more experienced officer, he was the considered the senior Vice Admiral because of his battle experience. So the command structure for the Grand Fleet went Jellicoe, Burney, and then Sturdee. With Jerem and Madden in there somewhere, but Madden would probably be aboard Jellicoe's flagship. So if anything happens to Jellicoe, the odds are something happens to Madden as well. It's one of those scenarios where, yeah, due to the size and complexity of this fleet, I have a Vice Admiral as my Chief of Staff. Great. He's aboard the ship with me. So if my ship blows up, that Vice Admiral's also gone. So as a senior Commodore, a senior Captain, and many, many senior commanders. I mean, literally, Jellicoe's staff that are aboard his flagship with him. Commodore Lionel Halsey as Captain of the Fleet. Master of the Fleet, Captain Olivia Els Leggett. Flag Lieutenants, Commander the Honourable Matthew Robert Best. Commander Charles Morden Forbes. Commander Alexander Rahel Radham. Commander Richard Lindsay Nicholson. Those are some senior officers. But there is a point here that we have to consider. Sturdee is not coming from nowhere. Sturdee has his own staff, he has his own people, he has his own following. Therefore, if he changes position, other people will change position as well. It's like today when you're dealing with admirals moving around or generals moving around from staff posting to posting. They will take senior officers, they will take their team with them. Yes, they will probably keep some of the existing team there. They will probably keep some of them. But they will take their own people with them. So this is going to change things. Also, we have to consider again some of the factors that are going to come into play this. If Sturdee is the commander of the Battlecruiser fleet at Jutland, and it does well, which it might do compared to history, even if he's then, even if after that Beatty comes back, takes back his post, i.e. gets better, we'll talk about what scenario I could see him taking it over in. It's very difficult to argue, therefore, that one of the most experienced Vice Admirals of the Royal Navy, when it's time to look for a new commander of the Grand Fleet, is not the one you pick. Beatty could argue because he'd got more battle experience, command battle experience than anyone else, and that was his case, because of Dogger Bank and all those things. Well, Sturdee's just done great at Jutland. It changes things. And also it's interesting to consider that he's in charge of the Iron Dukes. In fact, he's more than just in charge of the Iron Dukes. He has HMS Royal Oak in his 3rd Division, i.e. one of the 15-inch gun battleships. He has HMS Superb, HMS Canada, HMS Benbow, his own flagship, and he has HMS Bellerophon, Temeraire, and Vanguard. In simple terms, he doesn't have the easiest group to pull together, but he has arguably one of the most powerful, thanks to having HMS Royal Oak sitting there. Plus, he's got experienced officers with him, including his own Rear Admiral, the person in charge of his 3rd Division, is Sir Alexander Duff. I do love that name. He's a good Rear Admiral as well at this point. But if we leave that to one side, the Battle of Dogger Bank. We can't have the replacement take place before the Battle of Dogger Bank. Why? Because if we do, that changes history far too much. You see, if you change it to Dogger Bank before Dogger Bank, or at any point really around Dogger Bank, you are going to change a lot of history. For starters, you're going to give a long run up. But also, Dogger Bank is one of those battles where if you have anything like competent command going on and competent staff work, then half the signals that are sent wouldn't be sent. And the signals that are sent would be reworked. And would make more sense. And instead of you ending up with pretty much 5 battlecruisers bashing up a single armoured cruiser, you'd probably end up with a scenario where, honestly, the Germans would have been lucky to get away with 1 battlecruiser and 1 armoured cruiser sunk. I.e., at least another vessel, another major vessel, lost. There's a decent chance they end up losing more. At a certain point, therefore, if the Battle of Dogger Bank goes as bad as it could do under a competent commander, does the Battle of Jutland happen? Probably not. Because the Germans don't have first scouting group anymore. It's gone. A competent commander would have had them banged to rights. Beatty, for all his many issues, had caught them, had them in a perfect trap, and then he sends out confused signals, which means that all of the battle cruisers concentrate on, well, the Blucher. And so the Blucher is annihilated. But the thing was, it didn't have to be that way. Even if he'd had a competent second in command who'd been able to look at him and look at the Lion being disabled and gone, "You are therefore unable to command this. I will take charge and we'll sort it out later." It could have been a different battle. But an actual competent commander and a competent staff, and Dogger Bank is annihilation. Because they've got no support to go to. They've got no backup to run to. And that would change Jutland. That would change the entirety of World War I. The High Seas Fleet would be very differently handled. Because from that point onwards, they would have an overwhelming speed disadvantage versus the British forces. An overwhelming speed disadvantage. They would, unless they managed to build and get completed some new battle cruisers, which they are, it's unlikely to virtually impossible for them to actually do. Because anything they do like that is going to require stripping resources from supporting the manufacture for the ground forces, and that's going to be first priority always. So it isn't going to happen. At which point, honestly, the High Seas Fleet probably doesn't do much for the rest of World War I. So that's not an option. So now let's consider Jutland as it actually happened. As it happened, you have Jellicoe managing to cross the German T twice, with very limited to zilch information coming from his battlecruiser fleet commander. In fact, if it hadn't been for, and I'm going to make sure I get exactly this all right, I'm just about to call him Rear Admiral. He was soon to be a Rear Admiral, but at this point, Commodore William Goodenough, who is in charge of 2nd Light Cruiser Squadron, ubiquitous town-class cruiser squadron, in HMS Southampton. if it wasn't for him deciding that he was going to send some messages out to Jellicoe, even though it really isn't his job or his responsibility to do it, he's one of the light cruiser squadron's commodores that are supposed to be just assisting and supporting the battlecruisers. There is Rear Admiral William Packnam in charge of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron. There is Rear Admiral Osmond Brock in charge of 1st Battlecruiser Squadron. There is Vice Admiral Beatty. There are all sorts of senior officers there, all of whom should be thinking, has anyone told this guy that we're coming? Anyone? You haven't? Why haven't you? You thought you would, but no one has. Basically, they're all trained and still thinking in the Edwardian form of the Royal Navy that you rely on your senior officer to do their job and you report up the chain of command. So they're expecting Beatty and Beatty's staff to be telling Jellicoe what was going on. Good enough, after a while, starts to get worried. Has anyone actually told Jellicoe? And he sends through messages. Thank the Lord Lubberduck for good enough, because without him, a lot of this battle wouldn't have happened. But if you consider what Jellicoe does on the paucity of information he actually relieves, he is frankly amazing. And probably deserves more of a spot on a column in Trafalgar Square than Nelson does. Because at least Nelson had competent deputies who were telling him what he was doing, and he could see the enemy himself the whole time. Now, of course, people often then bring up the other intelligence failures during Jutland, the fact that Room 40 are asked where Shear's call sign is, not where Shear is. And Shear has this habit of changing his call sign when he goes to sea and adopting a different one, and leaving his call sign behind for any communications. And so they answer, honestly, it's back in Wilhelmshaven. And, okay, then the German fleet's not at sea. When that wasn't the question they'd asked. They didn't ask Room 40 where the German fleet was. They asked them where the call sign was. But the thing is, whilst that is the operations room getting involved in things which they don't necessarily and asking the wrong questions, that should have been counteracted very quickly. Should have been constantly under control by information being received from the people involved at the time. It was a constant need for information to be flowing backwards and forwards. In fact, honestly, Jellicoe couldn't have been running Beatty's battle for him, but if Beatty had been informing Jellicoe where he was, then Jellicoe would not have slowed down. And that's the big thing which delays the battle taking place. Jellicoe slowing down to a cruising speed to save fuel and allow his forces to all organise. If he's got the information about where the Germans are, he won't do that. Now, as it happens historically, as I said, there's the run to the south, where the Battlecruiser fleet are chasing 1st Scouting Group. Then there's the run to the north, where 1st Scouting Group and the High Seas fleet are chasing the Battlecruiser fleet. And then there is the battle. And then there is, of course, the night action as well. All these take place in a relatively short amount of time. The fleets actually see each other roughly at 2 o'clock, in terms of the Battlecruiser fleet seeing the High Seas fleet. And most of the fighting is over by 9 o'clock. Jutland is roughly a span of 7 hours. There is some fighting in the night, but we are talking about actions which do not take over a long period, are not carried out over a long period of time. Jutland, of course, itself is remembered as a battle which is, how do I put this, murky. The British lose more ships than the Germans do. British start with a lot more ships than the Germans do. The British repair their fleet that's damaged a lot quicker than the Germans do, and the British are back to full strength, and the Germans basically never repair some of their ships. However, saying that, Jutland has a lot of options and opportunities for the Royal Navy that just a basic level of communication going on between the Battlecruiser fleet and the ground fleet, as was supposed to be happening, would change. Would alter significantly. So, to change the history for our scenario, what happens in the 15 months in between Jutland and Dogger Bank? Well, I was thinking about this. If you replace Beatty after Dogger Bank, that's just been marketed as a victory, when really it wasn't, because they could have sunk so much more, but they have sunken the ship. So that's going to cause political issues and a massive political fallout, and there are enough politicians and enough newspaper people who are just about silly enough to believe it. So you can't do that. So you're left with an option of what could happen to Beatty. Well, Christmas, drinking, car accident. Go for a simple option. And you get damage enough in a car accident, you could be knocked out for a year. And you do need to be knocked out completely. He does need to be hospitalized. He does need to have his legs in casts and arms in casts and all sorts of things. So basically he has to have had an absolutely doozy of a wreck in a car. That's the only way it works. Or a train accident, but that would involve a lot of other people, and I don't like, even for the sake of a historical scenario, having a lot of unnecessary casualties. It's a car accident. It works. At that point, you have a problem, because if the car accident happens in December, you are a year after the Battle of January, Battle of Dogger Bank. So, okay, it's roughly 17 months. And it's not 15 months, it's 17 months in between the two. Roughly. Because January today is 12 months, and then there's 5 months on to get to May. So roughly 16, 17 months, actually, because it's 24th of January. So yeah, 16. We'll go for roughly 16 months. So they'd have roughly 5 months to fix things. First thing you're going to have in change-wise is command structure, because you bring in Sir Frederick Charles Doveton Sturdee, as I've suggested, you're going to have to make some changes. Now, Sturdee doesn't have a chief of staff per se in the role he's in. So I wouldn't be surprised if Beatty, who has served on Jellicoe's staff, who is a very good officer at certain points, isn't retained. However, here is the thing. For pretty much every promotion Sturdee has for a few years, a certain officer's name turns to turn up as Flag Lieutenant and later Commander. So I'm sorry, Honourable Reginald Alma Ranfurly Plunkett, you're out. You're replaced with Commander William Milburn James. And I'm fairly certain Seymour would be gone as well. I'm not sure who he'd pick as his second Flag Lieutenant, but he might even try. Somerville's a commander by this point, so don't think Somerville would necessarily want to come back and be a lieutenant, be junior to James. So I think he'd find someone. He has a habit of knowing how good and how important communications flags officers were, and he had a good crop of lieutenants as part of his staff, who would be lieutenant commander, some of them were lieutenant commanders by this point, who were with him in the Falklands. I'm not sure which of them he'd pick, but he'd probably grab one of them. Flagship. This is another interesting thing. We're, of course, used to be talking about Captain Alfred Chatfield, who goes on to become First Seal and all sorts of things. Well, the thing is, again, Sturdee has favourites. And he has a flag captain who follows him between multiple ships. And he's a very good officer. So I'm sorry, Chatfield, but you'd have your behind kicked out. And again, there are ways around it. Chatfield will probably find himself given a light cruiser squadron or something like that. Oh yes, you're being promoted, Chatfield. Goodbye. Don't worry. But it would be very quickly, there would be a changeover in some of the senior staff. You have some continuity in having Betnick still there, but you have a Sturdee bringing in his own team. And that makes sense. But this gives us a bit of a different order of personalities, because these officers are different. They are different. Why are they different? What am I sort of meaning when I'm calling them differently? Well, if we consider just James. Let's start off with him. He goes on to become a full admiral. He serves in the First World War and the Second World War. He served in Naval Intelligence Division when it was first formed in World War One. That's where he's come from before he joins Pakenham staff. So he is a very experienced naval intelligence officer. And after his appointment, he goes on to become the deputy director under Reginald Hall of the Naval Intelligence Branch. So, working in Room 40. Very different personality already from Plunkett. Plunkett is a very core naval officer, very much a, yes, we will do the duty, sir. Very, honour, standing, traditional. James is career naval intelligence, pretty much. Spends most of his life in battleships and battle cruisers. Knows his way. A very skilled gunnery officer. Will actually be in charge of the Royal Naval College at Greenwich in between 1925 and 26. Will be in charge of the Battlecruiser squadron itself between 32 and 34. In charge of Portsmouth Naval Base 1939 to 42, and Chief of Naval Information 1943 to 44. This is a very different senior staff officer. This is someone who knows the value of information, and is going to be making sure that information needs to get to where it's got to go. So it's none of this, let's all blame it on the most junior flag lieutenant malarkey. There are other officers there whose job it is to check what the junior flag lieutenant is doing. And they get completely out of the blame. All the blame gets put on Seymour traditionally. Well, it shouldn't be. With James there, no one's putting it on the junior rank because he will be checking. He'll be taking charge of that information flow himself. Betnick, of course, is the same. But he was a gunnery officer, and even he writes that he was worried about some of the Battlecruiser fleet's ideas when he came over from the Grand Fleet. Well, with having Grand Fleet senior officers, especially these particular officers, coming in, they're going to be looking at it and going, excuse me? It's a different world. And then we have Captain Henry Wise Parker. Well, let's consider his experience. He'd commanded a torpedo boat between 1896 and during 1896. He'd commanded HMS Haughty in 1904. Heckler, 1915. These are all quite small vessels. HMS Bembo. He commands 1915 to 1916 before getting Hercules when he goes with Sturdee, and then getting captain of the fleet, Atlantic Fleet. Why does he get that post? Well, Vice Admiral, now Admiral Madden, is now in charge of the home Atlantic Fleet, and his old friend Sturdee recommends his flag captain. So, his flag captain goes and becomes the captain of the fleet, which is a very senior post and is one of the senior staff officers of a commander-in-chief of a large fleet. It's one of the reasons, again, you can tell whether the fleet is a proper fleet or is a fleet in name only, whether it has a captain of the fleet in the Royal Navy in this period. The Battlecruiser fleet doesn't have a captain of the fleet. Now, Wise Parker, let's see, what's his experience? Well, he'd been a gunnery officer, of course. And he'd actually been an executive officer aboard HMS Indomitable. And he'd been executive officer aboard HMS Lion previously. He'd actually been on her before World War I began. So he knows his way around a battlecruiser. He knows how a battlecruiser is supposed to be run. This is not minor experience. So what will happen to the Battlecruiser fleet as well? What changes from December 1915 to May 1916 would take place? You've had the staff changes, but what changes would they bring into them? And I know this is a later position and image of, Renown and Repulse at in front of some other Royal Navy capital ships moving at high speed, but it serves its purpose. Well, there is possibly going to be a difference in level of trust. I think the first thing you'll have with this staff that you won't have with the other scenarios is you will still have the gunnery training going on, and we'll have the swapping over, and probably we'll still have 3rd Battle Squadron swapped with the 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron swapped with 5th Battle Squadron. But potentially you'll also have a fleet, you'll have them actually go up as the Battlecruiser fleet itself to Scapa Flow for training, gunnery drills. They might well take the full fleet up there for some fleet training. It's something which, if you want to, and if you really think it's necessary, because you believe in the value of accurate gunnery, you are going to push for. And remember, the lesson from Dogger Bank had been they aren't doing accurate gunnery, and it's taken a long time for them to get to the point of cycling squadrons up to the Scapa Flow for some training. Secondly, probably going to be placing a massive, we really want Renown and Repulse as quickly as possible order going on. I don't think they can be sped up that much, remembering my own work on those ships. I don't think they're as close to commissioning that they could if you've got 5 months notice, speed up to the point at which one of them might be in a service actually for Jutland. They were close after Jutland, but I don't think you necessarily get that changes. But I think the big change you're going to have is a difference in approach to Evan Thomas. I think communication, not just going up to the Grand Fleet, but also between squadrons, between formations, is going to be greatly improved. And I have a feeling that Thomas is not going to be, you've come down here in your squadron, and I'm going to ignore you until I need to take you to war. It's going to be a case of, yes, would you please join us for dinner? Let's have a conversation. We need to make you as one of us. And added to that, you have Sturdee's own experience at command. He is, to an extent, forced by experience to learn the value of bringing his officers together when he's forming a disparate command. That's what he had to do at the Falklands. when he had to bring multiple forces together in order to achieve a decisive victory. Yes, he was helped by luck and various other things at the time, but still, it matters. So this is a factor that's going to be part of this. This fleet is going to be different. I'd also go for gunnery differences, as well as gunnery training. I would probably suggest that they would, whilst they might not get much, I have a feeling there'd be certain things tightened up. Oh, you're leaving all those doors open. Oh, really? Why? Why? I don't fancy sitting on top of a cooker. The thing is, you are replacing a senior officer who cares very greatly about the image he's projecting and the image in his head of what a fleet action should look like and a fleet should be, with someone who cares about winning the battle and likes to bring his ships home in one piece and is, to an extent, used to commanding some of these ships. He's been involved in these forces before. He knows the weaknesses of battlecruisers. I don't want to, throw too much shade at Beatty. I know I often don't really consider him that great. But the thing is, he's different. And then that gives us to the point of the pre-battle phase. What's going to be going on at this point? Well, this is going to be different. And I know I keep using that word, but let me explain. What is the big difference going to be here? The big difference is I do not see 5th Battle Squadron falling as far behind. I do not see them being allowed to separate up. Yes, he can go faster than them. But they are a major part of his squadron. They are a major bulk of his firepower. If he splits up too far from them, you get into trouble. And you have to be able to retain them within signal range. So I wouldn't be surprised if Sturdee goes a bit slower. Now that might seem completely strange, but bear with me on this. These vessels, they could do roughly 23 knots. Maybe a little bit faster if pushed, but 23 knots. Definitely. 24 knots, possibly. 25 knots is what they were aiming for. 28 knots was what they had hoped for, but then they went with regular boilers, which got it down to 25 knots. And as you'll know, if you're designing a ship for 25 knots, in things like any of the games you can design your ships in, especially things like Ultimate Admiral, etc., it's rare they're actually 25 knot ships. Usually, if you want to guarantee they're a 25 knot ship, you design them for slightly faster than 25 knots, and they'll make 25 knots. So you pick sort of 25.5 knots, 26 knots, and yeah, they can do 25 knots. Great. So what does that mean? That means that the fleet, probably the Battlecruiser fleet, will be going forward at roughly 24 knots. The Grand Fleet, well, theoretically that's a 21 knot fleet, but practice, if that's doing top speed and doing top speed, it'll be about 20 knots. Because of keeping the fleet together, and again, the same thing as ships also wear down. Ships which are in service need to be cleaned, they need to be all sorts of things fettered and cared for to maintain their maximum speed. They're in service for any amount of time, that maximum speed drops. So, as rigorous as the British are, let's put the ground fleet down to a top speed of 20 knots. That's still pretty darn fast coming in. And the point is, if they're sort of going out to their position, that's going to be fast enough. Yes, as it was, you had traditionally the 5th Battle Squadron coming along at roughly 24 knots, trying to keep up with Beatty, who was trying to push every single ounce of speed he could out of his ships. And that is why there's such a distance. It's why, when we start looking at the Battle of Jutland, you start going, hang on, there's a distance forming up between these two groups. There's, 5th Battle Squadron is there. And Beatty is there. Where is this gap from? Are they part of the same fleet? Pretty much, as Beatty runs it, they might as well have been two separate small fleets, because they are so separate at this point. They're not able to operate really as one cohesive force. Because Beatty hadn't talked to Thomas. Beatty hadn't worked with Thomas. Beatty hadn't considered Thomas and the differences of the 5th Battle Squadron and to the rest of his force. He hadn't thought about that. He'd been arguing for these ships. He'd been wanting them so much, but at no point does he seem to have actually applied himself to thinking, hang on, if we have these ships, how do we frigating use them? Because they're not battle cruisers. They're not even fast battleships. The thing is, if they'd been built small tube boilers, yeah, they'd have been fast battleships. They'd probably been 28 knot ships. In which case, good luck to the German Navy. Because you've got armour equivalent to the best battleships of the time. And, in fact, arguably the best battleship armour of their time when built and when conceived. Although the R-Class does quickly come through as essentially slightly better in terms of armour and coverage. But capable of 28 knots? That's faster than some of the original Battlecruisers, and that's even faster than some of the German Battlecruisers could go. That means there'd be a battleship which could literally eat them for lunch. That's not a world those ships want to live in. And that's the entire reason why Renown are repulsed these 32, 33 knot ships. Because they are designed in a world where it's expected that battleships soon are going to be 28 knot ships. And the whole reason for a battlecruiser is it has to keep a speed advantage over battleships, otherwise it gets eaten. Because a battlecruiser is not designed to fight a battleship. Even the German battlecruisers are not designed to fight a battleship. They're designed to put up a fight with a battleship. There is a difference. Basically, one is designed to die gloriously, one is just designed to die, one will just die if it's caught in a close fight and cannot get away from the battleship. Because the German battlecruisers, the whole way through, like their armoured cruisers, are designed to support their battleships because they think they're going to be outnumbered. Which, of course, they are. So they're not going to have enough battleships to fight an even battle line, and to try and prevent themselves being doubled, here are our battlecruisers. They are going to try and hold you off long enough that hopefully our battleships win their fights, and then they are in good enough condition to come and beat up you after you've smashed up our battlecruisers. That's why the German battlecruisers are, if we go to that lovely thing I like to come and talk about on the channel, the capital ship spectrum, where you start off with the battleships at this end, the really tough, pure, everything's even armor, firepower, speed. They are designed to be the ultimate fighting machines in any scenario. And the battle cruiser, 2 words in this end, separate words, which are basically the ultimate cruiser. And then you have fast battleship and battle cruiser, 1 word. Designed to go and kill battle cruisers and also fight each other. Deciding that actually speed is a factor in operations, and if they can afford to be slightly less great armor and slightly less firepower than necessarily you might actually want to if they have sufficient enough speed. And it slowly goes into sort of this sort of vessel in the middle, but that's the sort of capital ship spectrum. So, you'd have the run to the south. How would the run to the south be different? Well, first things first. This is the run to the south takes place between roughly 3:30 and 5:30. Now, at 2 o'clock, when the fleets sort of start sighting each other, that's when you'd expect the first message to have gone through to Jellicoe. So Jellicoe would start speeding up again. He'd go up to roughly 20 knots and he'd start heading south. After them. They run south. They're not going to run south at not necessarily as fast as they can possibly get. They might do to try and chase them. Sturdee might well let the chase go, but he'll want to keep 5th Battle Squadron in range. He won't want this to happen. You see this break wouldn't have happened with Sturdee, because that's not the style of Commander Sturdee is. He wouldn't want to be that separate from 5th Battle Squadron. So his entire thing, he'd have kept them closer together. So they'd be so instead of having these two movements, you'd have one group coming south. Now that's going to affect things from the get-go, because it's going to mean 5th Battle Squadron, which have pretty much the best gunnery fire control systems in the Royal Navy at this time, along with the best guns probably available to the Royal Navy at this time, and probably the best gunners available to the Royal Navy this time, considering the amount of effort being put into training them and selecting them. Outside of HMS Iron Duke herself, I'm not sure you could get a finer group of gunnery sailors. Now, admittedly, they still have the same issue of having the same Royal Navy shells. Lord help us, and there is one problem, which is if the Royal Navy does do better at Jutland, does no one examine our shells and we end up with terrible shells in World War II, but we'll deal with that one later on down the road. Yeah, unintended consequences. World War I, Jutland doesn't go badly. World War II, Britain doesn't have the legacy of the Green Boy shells and all those developments to build upon to have decent shells in World War II, which means you have all sorts of issues then. Sometimes even making things go right can lead to all sorts of other consequences down the road. So they're going to go south. Now, I think probably you will end up with actually some shell examination, because I doubt this battle will go to plan even with all the advantages of having the good commanders in. They might win it, but there might be a case of, why didn't we absolutely smash the Germans? And instead of the whole debate over, oh, was it command issues, communication issues, all these things, in a case of, why didn't we were hitting the Germans and the shells weren't doing the damage? Because this was seen during the battle. At which point, there'd probably be a lot of examination. We would probably end up with Green Boy shells. Maybe not as quickly, maybe not as well motivated, because it wouldn't have been as bad a circumstance, but still, they would end up with better shells. Probably. There's like a 70% chance of it. So, if you've got these two groups together, the German squadron can maybe dictate the range slightly better, but the fact is you've got a lot more firepower, and that's going to cause trouble for the Germans on the way south. And also, remember at this point, Jellicoe isn't slowed down at this point. He's doing 20 knots. He's coming south. So traditionally, this goes on from 5:30 to, well, from 3:30 till 5:30. This is roughly 2 hours of the battle. 2 hours of the battle. At 1400 hours, they'd slowed down. But they were still getting closer together. Because that's when they'd heard the message that, you know, Scheer's call sign is still in Wilhelmshaven. But, yeah. At this point, you have the message come through. From here, from roughly 3:30, you get a message going to, well, going to Jellicoe and telling him what's going on. You might have had the message come through earlier, because again, with Sturdee in charge, there is a case that Sturdee's a little bit more paranoid. And remember, he'd had intelligence issues when he'd been in the Admiralty. He'd had intelligence issues when he'd been dealing with the Falklands. And he has James as his senior flag lieutenant. And James is an intelligence officer. And James is critical of the information which comes out of the operations room from room 40. And occasionally we do know James wasn't above sending his own private messages to people in the Admiralty to ask queries. So there is a whole running thing that you could get that actually James might send a message when he is this guy to Hall and ask Hall what the frigate is going on. Are the Germans at sea or not? And if Hall comes back and goes, yes, they are at sea, and she is leading them, that message would then go into Sturdee, and Sturdee would pass it on to Jellicoe, and we'd have all sorts of interesting things. But at this point, we've gone slow. Okay, that's how it happened as historically. We haven't completely rewritten it. We could argue to rewritten it. Historically, we do know that even in terms of 4th Battle Squadron, James did send a message. It's just, there's a difference in probably going through the comms network if you are the senior flag lieutenant of 4th Battle Squadron trying to contact the Director of Naval Intelligence, versus if you are the senior flag lieutenant of the Battlecruiser fleet trying to contact the Director of Naval Intelligence. I'm fairly sure, I would love to say that the communications network of the Royal Navy would treat both signals with equal importance, but we're all on this channel, I would hope, listening to this channel, real humans, and understand that the title and the unit you belong to can have an impact on how quickly and where your information and communication ends up. So, Run to the South happens. Now, the first big thing I would think that would be different, and this is during the Run to the North, is I don't think Indefatigable and Queen Mary explode. I think with the commanders in place, I wouldn't be surprised they still have issues, but you've had 5 to 6 months of senior officers in charge who are not going to tolerate the kind of scenarios you've had in the Battlecruiser fleet of gunnery, of all these shells and all this powder, floating around, and the shell doors, etc., and the magazine doors being left ajar to allow for more rapid movement of material. You've also had probably more gunnery training because you'll have officers who are absolutely obsessed with gunnery training in charge. So I wouldn't be surprised Indefatigable and Queen Mary get badly damaged, but I would be surprised if they exploded the same way. I think if you get a direct hit on a magazine, there is still a very solid chance that happens. But I don't think, from the information we have about their wrecks, I don't think either was a direct hit to the magazine. I'd also say there's going to be a difference caused by the fact that if you're close with 5th Battle Squadron on the route, and that firepower, those 32 15-inch guns, are going to be having an impact on the run south, on the run north. They're going to be having an impact on the fleet maneuvers. They did have an impact as it was, but those being involved in the fight, I wouldn't be surprised if the Germans don't get the chance to concentrate as much as they did on Indefatigable, on Queen Mary. There is, to an extent, certain amounts of luck in it, in that they appear out of the smoke. They suddenly become completely visible. There is some consequences of fate being against them that day. So I see the Battlecruiser fleet getting damaged. I don't see it necessarily getting blown up. And I think also you have the fact that the run to the north, etc., is probably going to be shorter, because Jellicoe will have been running south. Why? Because this will have happened. Historically, the battle takes place late in the day. Historically, we're talking an action which primarily takes place between 5:30 and 9 o'clock at night. So it takes place over 3.5 hours. Now, here is the thing. There could have been a notification sent as early as 14:30 hours. There could have been, as I pointed out, and updates every day. And a nice way that would then move it close enough that you'd be looking at him being involved in the fight at latest at latest 4 o'clock. However, even if you've got the information going through at 15:30 hours, so we push back the time to the historically accurate time, i.e. we've presumed everything else has gone pretty much the same as it had, other than the squadron staying close together, and, you know, there was no extra information, so it's a 15:30 hours that they spot. 15:30 hours that the Battlecruisers spot Hipper's forces. If we consider the positions the relative forces are at 15:30 hours, which is 2 hours before this happens. If Jellicoe starts he gets a message then and starts pushing south at 20 knots. If we consider the run south and then the run north, and a distance is covered in that period, and if we go back to this, you can see that is over a 2-hour period. If you think about all that, the odds are it's, instead of 5:30, it's 4:30. Maybe 5 o'clock latest, but could also be as early as even 4:15 or earlier than that. That actually the Grand Fleet comes rumbling into town and bumps into the High Seas Fleet. Especially the moment Jellicoe would have been told, "Hang on, we're not only chasing the first scanner group south. We spotted the High Seas Fleet. They're behind them and coming up behind them." Jellicoe is going to be going, "Woohoo!" This is a man we're talking about who managed with his staff to work out what the Germans were doing and cross their T twice in battle, the most decisive position could do, with the information he was given, which was basically nothing other than good enough reports. So if he's getting accurate, timely reports roughly every 15-20 minutes with an update as to where the Germans are, where the Battlecruiser fleet is, imagine what he can do. Now, the guns are still going to be the same. The shells are still going to be the same. So there are going to be the same other technical issues for the Grand Fleet in the battle. But let's think about this. If the Germans fight this fight, okay, yes, it'll be fought closer to German territory. Because, again, if we go back to all the way to this lovely slide I have right back at the beginning. Why did I put it so far back? If we consider where the battle takes place, and if you look at where it is sort of level with roughly Denmark, if it manages to take place further south, then that's going to be even closer to those minefields and the German area of control and definite control. But still, it's going to take place earlier in the day, which is going to make the subsequent manoeuvres for Scheer that much more difficult, because he doesn't have the night to run into. That's further away. There's a reason the fleet action is considered to last till 9 o'clock. So you add an extra hour. You add an extra hour and a half onto that fighting. There's a massive change going on. If Goodenough hadn't sent his message at 16:47, this is what Jellicoe managed to organise in 45 minutes, less than that. Imagine what he organises if he's had hours to put it together. The German High Seas Fleet would be walking into a trap. The largest trap the British have ever laid. They wouldn't just be crossing their T, there'd probably be torpedo boats coming from all sorts of angles. Everything that Jellicoe could think of would have been put in place. Not what he scrambled to put in place in 45 minutes, what he could put in place with several hours to think it through. Well, an hour and a bit to think it through. and constant updates and information, so he knows exactly what the Germans are doing and where they are. One of the interesting things is, what do the Battlecruisers do? The Battlecruiser fleet do if it's under Sturdee's command in this battle. I don't think it forms up into the line of battle. I think they take on the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, detach 5th Battle Squadron to join up with Jellicoe, and I think the Battlecruisers do what the Battlecruisers were supposed to do, were theorized to do, what people like Sturdee, Madden, Jellicoe had talked about them doing, which is act as a free safety and go south to try and block the Germans pulling this kind of maneuver. Because as the Germans tried to block off, right, and they're trying to get away. Frigate, all the battle cruisers are right there, blasting away. And the thing is, you spend any time fighting them, you won't be able to get away from the ground fleet coming behind you. That's the kind of scenario we're talking about. So what do I see happening? I see it turning into a maelstrom fight. I see it turning into an absolutely nasty, bitter fight going on in this battle. And I see the Germans suffering and mauling, but them fighting their way out. Because, again, the same scenarios are going to happen, the threat of torpedo attack, etc. And the fact that Jellicoe knows if he loses, if by some freak he loses enough ships, he's lost the war. So, for him, a draw is a win. For him, anything less than absolute losing is a win. So he can afford to not push it necessarily as hard as he'd like to, or as hard as he wants to. But I think he does push it hard. And I think probably the result in this scenario, and this is the point at which we're many changes down the scenario. We are many changes down the rabbit hole, and we're no longer able to really work through what is going to happen because of the changes compounding upon each other. And because Sturdee is a different style of commander than Beatty. I think what you end up getting, what you end up having, is a far different fight. But I think the Germans lose a lot of their scouting group, probably trying to bash their way through. I think probably the British do lose some battlecruisers in that kind of fight. But I also wouldn't be surprised if sheer volume of fire makes up for the fact the shells don't really work as well. And the fact that the British are pretty much in terms of their broadside are firing roughly 150 tons. 150 tons of shells every time they fire, for every cycle of their guns, versus the Germans roughly 61 tons. I just have this feeling that that wears, and well, you do have the British having 28 dreadnoughts to the German 16s. You do have 9 battle cruisers, the German 5. You do have 8 armoured cruisers to 0 German ones. And whilst the Germans do have 6 pre-dreadnoughts there, and I'm not really that confident on the armoured cruisers, I'm fairly certain the fact that even with the 6 pre-dreadnoughts and 5 battle cruisers, the fact that the German fleet of 27, let's say, capital ships, to group them all together, ranks in as less than the total number of dreadnoughts the British have there, let alone the number of dreadnoughts and battle cruisers and armoured cruisers the British have there and other things. I think it's going to be a nasty action for them. The British also have 79 destroyers to the German 61 and 26 light cruisers to the German 11. And this is the sort of fight we're talking about, which is not really what Jellicoe would like. Jellicoe would like a nice long range, a nice gunnery duel and keep it neat and tidy, but it'll end up in a close, nasty fight because the Germans will try and smash their way through the British line. And the British will be trying to block them so they can kill them. Because that's fundamentally what the battle is about. And At that point, numbers will start to tell. The British will suffer losses. Yes. The Germans will suffer a lot more. It will be a very nasty fight. You're talking about a scenario where, in capital ship terms, if we're just including battlecruisers, pre-dreadnoughts, and battleships, the British are bringing 37 to 27. So they can double some up. And yes, people go, well, German fire control, very good, very accurate. However, we're talking about a fight which, if you're trying to smash your way through an enemy line, is going to be getting down to close range. And that means it's going to be dependent on rate of fire. And sometimes lucky hits. And at close enough range, it doesn't matter what armor you have, those shells are getting through. Doesn't even really matter the quality of the shells at that point. At close enough range. I think you end up with a lot of ships like HMS Spitfire here from the night action. I think you end up with a lot of ships smashed and bashed. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the light cruisers and some of the destroyers do smash into things. On purpose. So the question is, does the night action happen still? No, I don't. I think the German fleet, whatever part of their fleet gets away, goes straight pell-mell for the minefield and tries to go through it at night. That could lead to their own to more losses in the minefield. But I think they try and get through it as fast as they can. And I think the British, after the battle, are probably not chasing them. They might try and finish them off. But they're also going to be wary about the minefield and German U-boats themselves, so they're not going to push it too hard. I think the British win the fight, as said. I just think the numbers and the ranging, the way it will work out, it's that the British have too many numbers. And with Jellicoe being able to get the information and Sturdee acting like he should do and positioning himself like he should do instead of trying to jump into the line, instead of trying to jump in for glory, actually positioning himself thoughtfully, which he would do, I think you have a difference there in how the outcome of things. I think you have a difference in the positioning of where the battlecruiser squadrons are. So I still think you lose battlecruisers. I just don't think you lose them where you historically do, and I don't think you lose them the way you historically do. And I don't think really the night action probably possibly there's a continuation of the day action with light forces especially continuing to harass the Germans if they've got any torpedoes left and all those things as they're trying to retreat. But yeah, I think the night action as it historically happened doesn't really happen. I just don't. So what happens post-battle? Well, post-battle, the British are going to be rapidly trying to rebuild their forces. I also think that if enough damage has been done to the Germans, you might well see the British pushing into the Baltic. Because that was always a British aim. If the British can push into the Baltic, they know they can shut down the German economy pretty much instantaneously. So if they've destroyed enough of the High Seas Fleet, that's what Jellicoe will be building up to do next. But I also think post-battle, the Grand Fleet 1916-18, when Jellicoe will be promoted, this time with glory. He's won a major battle, and decisively so. He'll be promoted to First Sea Lord with all the laurels that come with it, and all the glory to try and fight the submarine war, because the Germans are going to be redoubling their efforts, because basically their navy's just been beaten up. Yes, they historically do end up coming to the same conclusion, and redoubling their submarine efforts, to fight to wage the battle, the submarine war against the British, etc., the trade war. But that's almost a begrudging they're coming to that realization. Whereas I think if they've lost the Battle of Jutland, and decisively so, in a mauling fight, they're going to be pushing for that a lot more quickly. I think probably command of the Grand Fleet goes to Sturdee. Because Sturdee's just proved himself excellent at the job and has done these glorious things. Now he's won the Falklands. He's now done a glorious part of this battle unambiguously. Everyone will be happy with him for it because he's done the job he's supposed to. I don't think Beatty gets command. Even if Beatty is recovered from his unfortunate car accident, I don't think he gets command of the Grand Fleet. I don't think he can push for it, because Sturdee's just done this great achievement, and Sturdee will be still a senior Vice Admiral. So that makes things different again, because now you have a free-range Beatty wandering around. Maybe he's given them a training command, something to get rid of him. I wouldn't be surprised if Sturdee and Jellicoe come up with that idea, get rid of him as quickly as they can. But you know, it will depend on what they want to push through. Post-war, well, Sturdee traditionally does actually die historically in 1925. But the thing is, if he's commanded the Grand Fleet and he's had that impact, and possibly been the person who's been on those exercises with King rather than Beatty, and Sturdee would probably have given King a very different impression of the Royal Navy than Beatty gave, well, then you have a different scenario happening altogether. Washington Naval Treaty could be different. Sturdee is very different from Beatty in terms of his political aims and his fleet aims. And the results of the Washington Naval Treaty could therefore be different in how he negotiates with government. I think the most interesting thing would be the fleet air arm, because, interestingly enough, Sturdee is one of the earliest people who's opposed to the idea of the fleet air arm, and by that he means the aircraft operating from ships being handed over to the Royal Air Force. There is a very interesting thing that if he is the prospective First Sea Lord, he is advising the officers involved over what to do, whether to agree to the whole handing over the Royal Naval Air Service to the RAF, etc. I wouldn't be surprised if he argues no. I wouldn't be surprised if he says, look, they can have control of everything, but they can't have control of the fleet air arm. The aircraft operating from carriers, the aircraft operating from cruisers and capital ships are going to be the Royal Navies. They're going to be unambiguously the Royal Navies, and they're only a small portion of the force, and frankly, we need them to be part of us because the ships are one because we're operating all around the world. I could see him making that case quite successfully. And especially even more so if he's able to point to Engadin's actions in the Battle of Jutland and the information she gave. So, summary. It all comes down to communication. It really does. It really does all come down to communication, and it's an interesting thing to consider in that front. World War I is one of those first wars where you start having battles, especially fleet battles, which are happening over distances where you can no longer rely on communication by flags. And frankly, you should not have been relying on communication by flags. Radio becomes more and more important and more critical. And it perhaps always should have been. But no, Sturdee taking command rather than Beatty, that's a whole can of worms. Anyway, I've been quite vague on the post World War I scenario for a reason. I want to hear what you think Sturdee as First Sea Lord rather than Beatty would lead to. What kind of decisions and what kind of differences might be different? Might occur. Sorry. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. What have we got coming up? We have got next week, I think it's building the fleets of Trafalgar. That's going to be cool. I think I've already written those slides. And next week we have Livewise, we have Norway stands. World War II if Norway repels the German invasion. And I definitely have already written those slides. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.